What happens when a Hollywood legend who's built a lifetime on silence and principle faces off against a network host who's mastered control and spin? When Clint Eastwood sits across from George Stephanopoulos under the blinding studio lights, what starts as a routine interview turns into a televised standoff. Every question becomes a jab, every silence a threat. The tension builds like a loaded gun between them, and in the end, there were no shouts, no theatrics, just one line from Clint, enough to make the entire show collapse into silence. Trust me, this talk show won't disappoint you. It'll be worth every second of your time. The studio lights burn a little too bright for this early in the morning. The air feels still, rehearsed. Good Morning America isn't used to tension, but today something's different. The cameras hum, the crew stands a little too straight, and even the audience claps with a strange kind of hesitation. They're about to watch an interview, but they don't know it's about to turn into a showdown. Clint Eastwood, 94 years old but still walking like he owns every step, takes his seat across from George Stephanopoulos, the network's golden boy, the man famous for asking polite questions that cut like razors. George flashes the kind of smile that looks friendly on camera, but fake up close. All teeth, no warmth. "Welcome back, legend," he says, voice smooth but carrying something sharper underneath. Clint gives a slow nod, his eyes locked on George, like a man who's already smelled the trap. "I'm here to talk about people who serve," he says, calm but cutting. "Keep your questions clean." The crowd laughs lightly, thinking it's small talk. But Clint's tone isn't light. It's a warning, the kind only a man his age can deliver without raising his voice. George straightens in his chair, hiding a smirk. The tension is quiet, but it's real. Then George drops it. One word. Exclusionary. It lands soft but poisonous, and everyone knows it. The air shifts. Clint doesn't blink. He stares right through George, voice dropping to a steady growl. "Words don't wound me, George," he says. "Assumptions do." That's the moment the smiles fade. George leans back, playing the innocent. "I'm just saying context matters." Clint tilts his head, the faintest hint of a smirk appearing. "Context isn't a leash," he fires back. "It's a map. Stop tearing the corners to fit your route." The crowd goes silent. Even George's grin twitches for the first time. The atmosphere feels heavier now. The air inside the studio tightens. George knows he has to push harder if he wants a reaction, and Clint can sense it coming. "Let's talk about that empty chair moment," George says, voice calm but loaded. "You mocked a sitting president on live TV. What were you thinking?" He leans forward slightly, eyes sharp. Clint doesn't blink. "I made a point," he says flatly. "You made a poster. Don't sell me as your slogan." The line lands hard. George smirks, pretending not to feel the hit, but it shows in his eyes. The crowd senses it too. The interview just turned personal. George shifts tactics, trying to sound reasonable. "Influence comes with duty, Clint," he says. "When you speak, millions listen. You owe people accountability." Clint leans back, voice steady, but colder now. "Duty is truth, not trend," he replies. "I won't bend for your ratings." It's quiet, but the tension is loud. The kind of silence that feels like it's waiting to break. George looks down at his cards, then back up, smiling through the sting. He's losing control, and Clint knows it. "You're not asking," Clint says finally, his tone cutting through the air. "You're arranging. This isn't curiosity, it's choreography." The sentence hits like a hammer. George freezes for half a beat, realizing the game's flipped. George leans forward, his voice steady but sharpened to a fine edge. "You've made a lot of statements over the years, Clint," he says, flipping through his cue cards like a prosecutor flipping evidence. "Your comments on leadership, on America, on what it means to be a real hero, some would say they reveal a pattern." He pauses, letting the word pattern hang like an accusation. Clint doesn't move. His gaze is fixed, unshaken. "You're not interviewing me," he says calmly. "You're building a case, not a question. Counsel, watch your leading." The crowd gives a soft, nervous laugh, unsure whether they just heard a joke or a warning. George pushes again, a little faster now. "I'm just saying, people change with the times." Maybe your views don't fit the America we live in anymore. Maybe you're stuck in the past. He lets the words drip with condescension, but Clint doesn't blink. Instead, he leans in slightly, voice low, rough, deliberate. Stuck in the past, he repeats. I lived it, bled it, filmed it. The past taught us backbone, George. You calling that outdated? The crowd murmurs. George's smile twitches. He wasn't expecting resistance this clean, this surgical. Clint's not fighting with volume. He's dismantling him with control. Clint straightens, his tone now like steel under calm. You know what the problem is? He says. You think journalism is a cross-exam with applause. Pick one, story or sentence, because right now, you're confusing them both. For a moment, George has nothing. The cards in his hand suddenly look smaller, useless. Clint sits back, steady as stone. The tempo shifts. The air, once sharp with confrontation, now feels heavier, slower, but no less intense. Clint's voice drops into something quieter, steadier. My duty is to be honest, he says, eyes locked on George. Not agreeable. The words don't hit like a punch. They cut like a scalpel. George, trying to recover the rhythm, softens his tone. So no regrets? He asks, pretending to sound curious. Clint doesn't blink. I regret how fast people stop listening, he replies. They hear one thing they don't like, and suddenly the whole truth doesn't matter. His delivery isn't angry. It's weary, the kind of exhaustion that only comes from decades of watching people twist meaning into noise. George tries to pivot, hoping to pull the spotlight back. Let's talk about your heroes, he says. You call them ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What does that mean to you? Clint exhales, slow and steady, as if setting down a weight he's carried too long. It means showing up when no one's clapping, he says. Teachers, firefighters, soldiers, people who do the job because it needs to be done. No hashtags, no speeches, just work. The audience goes still. For the first time, Clint's words don't feel like defense. They feel like testimony. George senses the power slipping away again and tries one last redirect. Some people might say you sound like a preacher, he says lightly. Clint leans forward, voice low but firm. If you want confession, find a booth, he says. If you want truth, lose the script. The silence that follows is long, electric. George glances at his notes but doesn't touch them. Clint's not just answering questions anymore. He's redrawing the boundaries of the interview itself. George tries to soften his tone, but the edge is still there. I just want to make sure people understand the context of what you've said in the past, he says carefully. Clint gives a small, tired smile, the kind that carries more weight than words. Context, he repeats, his voice low. Context isn't costume, George. Stop dressing old lines for new outrage. The line lands hard. The audience doesn't move. Even the air feels still. George clears his throat, trying to keep his composure, but he's slipping again, and everyone can see it. He tries another angle. But don't you think there's a moral duty when millions of people listen to you? It sounds reasonable, but Clint doesn't take the bait. His tone sharpens, steady as ever. Moral duty, he says, is saying it straight when straight is unpopular. The line cuts deep, not loud, not flashy, but final. George shifts in his seat, his confidence thinning. For every card he flips, Clint turns it into a mirror. Now the balance of power has shifted completely. Clint's voice is calm, but the control in it feels unshakable. Ask, he says quietly, don't allege. You blur that line, the truth gets hit first. George doesn't answer. The cameras keep rolling, but for the first time, he looks like the one under interrogation. The silence between them feels heavier than any question he's asked all morning. The air in the studio changes. It's no longer polite, no longer balanced. Clint's tone turns cold, his voice slow and cutting. You invited me here under false pretenses, he says, leaning forward just enough to make George blink. You told my team this was about real heroes, not about rehashing politics. The audience shifts in their seats, sensing the temperature rise. George crosses one leg over the other, trying to regain his calm. This is accountability, Clint, he says with that tight media smile. People want honesty from legends like you. Clint lets out a dry laugh. No, George, this isn't accountability. This is auditioning for outrage. You're not after honesty, you're after ratings. The smile fades from George's face. That's not fair, he says. Clint doesn't miss a beat. Neither is ambushing someone on live TV, but here we are. George clears his throat, trying to recover his footing. You're overreacting. These are just questions. Clint nods toward the stack of cue cards in his hand. Questions? He repeats. No, that's not what this is. This isn't inquiry. It's an itinerary. A roadmap to a verdict you wrote before I even walked in. George glances down at the cards, his grip tightening. That's not true, he says quietly. Clint tilts his head, his voice calm but razor sharp. You think if you build the right case, throw enough words like controversial and divisive, you can paint me however you want. You're not interviewing me, George. You're staging me. The silence stretches thin, and the audience can feel every word like a nail being hammered in. George finally snaps back, his voice rising. So what? I can't challenge you? You think you're above the questions? Clint's eyes narrow, the faintest smirk forming. I'm not above the questions, he says. I'm just not stupid enough to mistake a setup for one. George laughs nervously, but his voice cracks halfway through. You're saying I'm setting you up? Clint's tone doesn't change. Calm, deliberate, deadly. I'm saying you came here pretending to listen. He pauses just long enough for the cameras to catch the look in his eyes, then finishes. This isn't journalism, son. This is a hit job. The words drop like a hammer. George opens his mouth, but nothing comes out. The lights hum overhead. Clint sits back, motionless, in full control now. And for the first time in his career, George Stephanopoulos looks like the man under interrogation. George leans forward, his voice rising just enough to sound defensive. So that's it, Clint? You're walking away from accountability? His tone carries more panic than conviction now, and he knows it. Clint stands calm and measured, the mic wire slipping through his fingers. He doesn't rush. He never does. No, George, he says, eyes fixed on him, voice steady as stone. I'm walking away from a bully. The word bully hits harder than a shout. George freezes for half a second, then forces a laugh, trying to hide the sting. A bully, he says, smirking. That's a little dramatic, don't you think? Clint tilts his head, unimpressed. No, he replies. What's dramatic is dressing up ambush as journalism and calling it integrity. George opens his mouth, but Clint doesn't let him breathe. You wanted a viral moment, he adds, voice cutting through the silence. Well, congratulations. You just got one. The crowd murmurs now, the tension electric. George straightens, trying to take control back. The conversation isn't over, he insists, pointing toward Clint like a man trying to command authority that's already gone. Clint turns halfway, that familiar half smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, the kind that says he's seen too many fights to care about one more. It ended, he says, his tone quiet but lethal. When you stopped listening. George tries again, his voice shaky. You think walking off makes you right? Clint looks back, eyes sharp. No, he says. It just means I don't wrestle with people who confuse headlines for truth. The room goes silent again. George swallows hard, realizing he's completely lost the narrative. Clint steps closer to the desk, his voice calm but laced with steel. You wanted a confession, but all you exposed was your own agenda. That's not a conversation, George. That's theater. Clint glances down at the stack of cue cards one last time, then back up at George, delivering his final words like a verdict. Principles don't change because fashion does, he says evenly. Keep the costume. I'll keep the truth. George tries to respond, but Clint's not listening anymore. He turns, walking toward the edge of the stage with slow, deliberate steps. The studio lights hit his back, turning him into a silhouette, unbothered, unbroken, unashamed. George calls after him. You're running away, Clint. Clint doesn't even turn around. No, he says, his voice echoing through the silence. I'm walking away from the noise. The audience doesn't applaud. They don't have to. The power in the room has already shifted, and Clint Eastwood just walked out owning every second of it. The studio feels hollow after Clint's footsteps fade, but his words still hang heavy in the air. The control George once had is gone, replaced by the weight of silence. The cameras are still rolling, but no one dares to speak. Off air, somewhere between pride and reflection, Clint's voice lingers like a closing line in a book. "I didn't walk away from the fight," he says quietly. "I walked away from the noise." It isn't anger, it's clarity. He didn't retreat. He reclaimed his ground. George sits at the desk, eyes fixed on the empty chair across from him. His cue cards are scattered, his voice smaller now. "If the question needs a trap to stand," Clint had said before leaving, "it's not a question. It's a trick, the truth of it stings." The line replays in George's mind as he tries to summon something, anything, to fill the dead air. "We'll be right back," he says finally, but it comes out thin, meaningless. A reflex, not a recovery. Somewhere beyond the lights, Clint's words echo one last time, not as a sound, but as a principle carved into the moment. Truth doesn't need a cue card. The cameras linger on the empty seat for a few more seconds, as if the lens itself understands what just happened. There's no applause, no music, no rescue cut. Just quiet, the kind that tells everyone watching that. For once, the legend didn't lose control of the interview. He rewrote it. Before you go, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell us what you think in the comments. Keep that notification bell on, because the next confrontation is already loading, and it's bigger, louder, and far more shocking.